Sony Pictures Marvel Studios' Madam Web is impressively bad. It's almost difficult to put into words how bad this movie is, and that's even considering the last few entries into this godforsaken addendum to the MCU. So we should probably talk about that first. For a while now, Sony has been working on this separate but still kind of contiguous universe with the MCU known as the Sony Spider-Man universe, or SSU if you prefer, which is ironic considering Spider-Man himself doesn't appear in any of these films. And for the record, it is still extremely confusing and up in the air whether or not these movies actually take place within the MCU. Many of you probably already know that there was a post-credit scene in Spider-Man No Way Home in which Eddie Brock from the Sony Venom movies shows up in the MCU universe, seemingly confirming that these two universes coincide somehow. And if you saw Venom Let There Be Carnage, you would know that Venom was transported to the MCU via Spider-Man No Way Home's kind of like portal nonsense thing at the end of that movie. Then, of course, there's the post-credit scene in Morbius, in which Vulture from Spider-Man Homecoming, played by Michael Keaton, is transported into the Sony universe because of the Spider-Man portal nonsense, and he says this.
I'm not sure how I got here. Has to do with Spider-Man, I think. I'm still figuring this place out, but I think a bunch of guys like us should team up. Could do some good.
This scene was the first confirmation of what Sony has been planning for a very, very long time. Probably longer than even you realize, and we're going to talk about that. But first, hello! I'm back! With another talking video. It's been a while, hasn't it? For those of you who are new, welcome to the assorted smattering of slop that this channel kind of turned out to be. And without any further ado, let's get into it.
What do you want from me? Why do you care for me? What do you know?
To talk about Madam Web, we have to examine the SSU as a whole, and more specifically, where it came from. The origin of the SSU is from a movie some of you might not expect. The SSU really started all the way back with
You're a fraud, Spider-Man!
That's right, as early as 2013, during the production of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony originally envisioned this expanded universe of Spider-Man-related characters. You may remember the scene from Amazing Spider-Man 2 in which mysterious hatted figure walks through the setup room. This scene, and other not-so-subtle clues throughout the film, were all building toward one thing: an interconnected set of films all starring Spider-Man villains and other supporting characters. And at the center of it all was this plan for a Sinister Six film. The Sinister Six, of course, being a famous team of Spider-Man villains from the comics, composing 6 major characters that all team up to fight Spider-Man. But after the extremely poor reception of Amazing Spider-Man 2, the plans were scrapped. Or so we thought.
What the hell are you? We are Venom.
In 2018, just a little while after Sony had allowed Spider-Man into the MCU as part of a new contract, Venom is released. The film received mixed reviews, but did do fairly well, all things considered. What most people didn't realize at the time was that Sony was testing the water to see if their plans of an expanded Spider-Man universe were still viable, and Venom had just told them that it was.
Why would we do that?
The coming years would see 2 more releases in the form of a sequel to Venom, Let There Be Carnage, and Morbius, which
Morbius, I got that acrimonious odious. Here's the bats are copious.
As many at the time stated, I still don't understand why this movie was made. Morbius plays out something like a pointless early 2000s random superhero movie like Elektra or Catwoman. Except that people generally know who Catwoman is, at least. With Venom, I can understand what they were thinking. Venom is a very famous Spider-Man villain. He has a lot of his own comics and stories to work off of. I get it. But who in the entire universe was clamoring to see a film about Morbius? All three of these SSU movies suffer from a lot of the same problems, in my opinion. Lackluster writing, poor character work, middling special effects, and threadbare plots that seem to do nothing more than keep you in your seat long enough to be technically considered a feature film. You can feel the desperation of the Sony executives desperately pulling at anything they have to try and create a cinematic universe. Because apparently all these major studios think cinematic universes are the way to go now because the MCU did well. I mean, Universal tried it with the Dark Universe. Tom Cruise's The Mummy was supposed to set that up, but that failed. And this one honestly doesn't seem to be doing much better, but for some reason Sony continues to chug along. What's sad is that the concept of relatively unknown characters getting their own solo superhero films isn't unworkable. I mean, we've seen success with this before with movies like Blade. But I think the reason Blade succeeds is that it's willing to not take its source material too seriously. It's a movie about killing vampires, so we're gonna have a lot of fun action sequences of killing vampires. I mean, it knows what you want. It gives you what you want. It's good. It's a good movie. And I think if Sony had embraced this design philosophy when making their films, it probably would have turned out a lot better. Imagine if Morbius was a pitched battle between a living vampire and Blade the Vampire Hunter, or if Venom was a dark relationship comedy between Eddie Brock and the symbiote. What we get instead are three middling attempts to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And in trying to please everyone, it seems Sony has pleased just about no one. Perhaps it's time we also address the elephant in the room that these characters are all villains. You would think that would be an easy one to get right, but Sony can't even do that apparently, because each of these films portrays the character as an anti-hero, a sort of darker take on the classic MCU heroes we've come to know. Of course, all that really ever amounts to is they kill some nameless bad guys instead of putting them in prison in bloodless PG-13 fashion. And because the Sony executives seemingly insist on these characters being portrayed as protagonists, their villains end up being just exact copies of them, but evil-er? The villain in Venom is just another symbiote, but he's worse, but I guess. Then in Venom 2, they really spice it up by doing another symbiote, but he's worse, I think. And then in Morbius, we have he's another vampire, but he's worse. Here we have characters that are so devoid of their own context separate from Spider-Man, and their own supporting cast of characters that Sony has resorted to just taking another version of the same character and using it as the villain. And I know that Riot and Carnage have existed for a long time before this, but I'm saying that if this is the best you can come up with for a full film, maybe you don't have enough ideas to make it work. Movies like Guardians of the Galaxy took relatively unknown heroes and turned them into something that people love. Movies like Morbius take relatively unknown villains and proceed to do nothing of interest with them. So why, after all these terrible receptions, do these movies keep being churned out? The answer is, none of these films really matter. At the end of the day, Sony is still trying to get to that Sinister Six team-up above all else, and each of these movies is just a stepping stone to that goal. It came as no surprise then when the trailer for Kraven the Hunter was released, the next in this SSU, which, aside from some minor scenery changes, seems to be the standard fare at this point. I, of course, can only speculate because the film never came out. As of the filming of this video, Kraven the Hunter is set to release this summer, when it was originally set to release last year. One can only hope that this delay will allow them to make the film better, because that always happens. But fear not, intrepid fans of the SSU, Sony did not let us down, because instead of Kraven the Hunter, we got...
I know that when you see Madam Web, you're gonna love it. In fact, I think you're gonna see it twice.